Tonight's video has 4 stories, each one different from the last, but sharing one thing in common: eeriness. You see, it doesn't always need to be shock factor that scares a listener. Sometimes, the daunting fear of the unknown can cause a deeper effect on the mind. We will be starting things off with a story of a delivery driver, with a regular customer who offers great tips, but as we'll find out, it is he who may pay the price. Then, I'll be telling 2 stories involving creatures in the woods. But I can promise you, these stories are not going to play out the way you think. And lastly, a story of a family who finds out their would-be home of peace is anything but. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. The first year after I graduated college wasn't a good one for me in a lot of ways. Having just gotten a bachelor's degree in a major that offered basically zero employment prospects, I kept right on living in my studio apartment across the street from the college, while my classmates moved away to start promising new jobs. Since I wasn't going to give my father the satisfaction of me winding up waiting tables like he always said I would, I chose the next best job there was that could earn me enough tip money to live off of. I became a delivery driver at a submarine sandwich shop. I wish I hadn't been so prideful and just accepted my father's scorn. When you're a delivery driver, the shifts are long and most of what you make just goes right back into your gas tank. Of course, it being a college town, I was rarely bored. Some customers will be more than happy to invite you inside and have you smoke some weed with them from time to time. You can get away with it too, if business that day is slow enough. Then there are the various co-eds who answer their doors in scandalous states of undress. But usually that just happens to be what they wore to bed the night before, and they don't feel like it's worth getting fully dressed just to accept a sandwich and a Pepsi from a skinny, non-threatening looking guy they'll probably never see again. Nothing like you'd see in a dirty movie ever happened on those runs. Although, not for my lack of wanting them to. Unfortunately, I needed more from life than just hasty puffs from beer bongs and the glimpse of nipples pressing erect against the inside of a slept-in t-shirt. I'd gotten as far as graduating college, but I had no further plan for my life, and I was growing deeply depressed. Autumn that year was particularly wet, and as the days grew colder, rainier, and darker, my mood did as well. It was a Tuesday in late September when I got the order for the house on Lamont Street. It was for 2-foot-long sandwiches, a bowl of pasta, and a bottle of soda, an order that, with sales tax, came to $21 and some change. Under the special delivery instructions it said, "Go to back door." I hated deliveries like that. No delivery driver likes a situation where they can't be seen from the road. That probably sounds strange coming from a guy who at the time thought nothing about going into strangers' houses to smoke weed. But as a driver, you develop certain instincts. A sense where you know that if a situation is safe to get further involved in or not. You didn't like the feel of a house or its occupants, and you could just say no and be on your way. Go to a door that's hidden from public view, however, and you have no way of knowing what you could be walking into. But the only other driver working that afternoon was Janice, and I knew what was dangerous for me as a 5'11" man was even more so for a 5'4" single mother like her. I could almost hear her sigh audibly in relief behind me as I bit the bullet and headed out the door to the house on Lamont Street. The place looked ordinary enough, modest 1-story ranch. I remember its brown vinyl siding looked warm against the gray and rainy September sky, like the chips in chocolate chip cookies when they're fresh out of the oven. It looked safe, like where a comfortable retiree might live, despite it having 2 separate front doors, one on the porch and one by the garage. I followed my instructions and headed around the back. The deck, while not rotting, wasn't water sealed. I remember thinking that if the rain kept up like they were, then by spring it was going to be in rough shape. I knocked on the door and almost immediately heard a man's strong, deep voice booming from the other side. "Come on in, it's open." I hesitated. Even with all the outlandish things I had seen in my brief career running deliveries, I'd somehow never had a customer ask me to open the door before. Cautiously, I turned the doorknob and opened the door a few inches, stating that I was the food delivery. The only light within came from the kitchen. Between it and myself was a large room, suitable to be a rec room or family room, except that it was completely bare except for a large wood-burning stove in the middle and a computer mounted on a tiny desk in the corner by the kitchen. A man sat at the desk, hunched over it, typing carefully on the keyboard. He was a large man with a powerful build, and he looked to be in his mid-30s. "Sorry, I can't get up," he said, the same voice still strong but friendly. "This is for work and I'm on a tight deadline. Just set it over there on the counter. The money's there for you." He appeared to be working on some sort of spreadsheet, although with his shaggy hair and beard, flannel shirts, blue jeans, and work boots, he looked more like an auto mechanic than a work-from-home executive or savvy day trader. Oh well, who was I to judge? Somebody who had that instinct about what places were safe and what weren't. That was who. The guy had at least 100 pounds on me easy. If he got up and decided to put himself between me and the door after I walked in, there wouldn't be much I could do. But watching the guy, it was like he had already forgotten about me. He was so focused on the dates on his screen, it was like I wasn't even there. I could have laughed at myself. My job put me in dozens of unsafe situations every day, and I was too depressed to care. Yet here I was getting myself all worked up over some tired, overworked guy who just wanted some food. I took the leap of faith and crossed the linoleum floor to the kitchen countertop he had indicated. The light shone over a spotless kitchen, and I mean it was spotless, like you could have smelled the lemon-scented cleaning product. The trash can, with a clean, black liner inside, looked like it had never seen a single piece of trash. Beyond the kitchen, I could see the living room. It was empty too. No couch, no TV, no nothing. But I could also dimly see those two front doors, and I noted that on this side, they were closed fast with 3 strong deadbolts apiece. "You just move in?" I asked, as I sat down the bag of food. "I'm just here in town for work," the man said pleasantly, but without turning around. "And I only cook when I have to." "I hear ya," I said with that forced, conversational chuckle that people in the service industry are masters of. "I'll get you your change," I said as I scooped up the 2 crisp, new $20 bills that lay upon the counter. "Keep the change." "Are you sure?" I tried to keep the awe out of my voice. I didn't think I had heard him right. "I'm sure," he restated firmly. "Change is all yours." Now there was nothing forced at all as I thanked him and wished him a great day. Even a big, creepy mountain man in a dark, empty house stops being scary when he's suddenly giving you an $18 tip. "Thank you too," he said, as I reached the door. "You'll probably hear from me again tomorrow. Like I said, I don't cook unless I absolutely have to." I came back around the house a lot happier than I had been when I'd gone behind it. Happier than I'd been in days, in fact. With an $18 tip burning a hole in my pocket, it was easy not to care that the whole time I had been in the man's house, he had never looked at me once. The man was as good as his word. We did hear from him again the next day, at the exact same time, down to the minute. He placed the exact same order as the day before. The same 2 sandwiches with the same toppings, same pasta dish, same soft drink, and the same 21 and some change total, and also the same instructions about coming to the back door. I had told Janice about the man and she was more than happy to let me take this delivery again. Given the man's size, she didn't like the idea of going into his house alone with him no matter how harmless he seemed. I did nothing to disabuse her reticence, by which I mean I hadn't told her about the $18 tip. The delivery went exactly as it had before. I knocked and went inside. He didn't look up from the columns of data on his computer screen. I placed the food on the counter where 2 $20 bills awaited me. Again, he told me to keep the change. I couldn't believe my luck. Getting a tip that big for such a small order was unheard of. Getting it 2 days in a row, beyond all probability. He mentioned once again that he'd probably call the next day, and I was overjoyed. Thanks to him, this miserable gig was becoming pretty lucrative. I did notice, however, that he seemed to be wearing the same flannel shirts and old, worn jeans as he had the day before. Had I not spotted the bags and wrappers from the previous day's meal at the bottom of the garbage can, I would have almost believed he had never gotten up from his place at the computer desk at all. Day after day, it was the same thing, and the days turned into weeks. I'd make the delivery, and the 220s would be on the counter, just like always. He never wanted the change back. If he ordered on my days off, the other drivers never mentioned him. Maybe he did and they, like me, kept mention of the huge tips to themselves. Or maybe he did, and just didn't tip other drivers nearly as well. Against my better judgment, I began to grow curious about what exactly the man did for a living. Any field that let you work from home while paying well enough that you could afford to spend $40 on takeout, almost every single day, seemed like a field that I would want to get into. But somehow, I never got the courage to ask. Despite him being pleasant almost to a fault, there were things about this customer that just scared me. For one thing, he never changed his clothes. It was the same flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots every day. For another, the trash can slowly filled with the empty bags, wrappers, and containers from his meals until it eventually overflowed. Soon I was watching an advancing army of fast food trash slowly spreading out from the base of the trash can. With his eyes glued to the monitor, I sometimes wondered if the man was even aware. Could he really not know that he sat just feet away from an advancing mound of garbage? The thing that bothered me the most, however, was the dropping temperature. Despite the chilly, rainy weather, the temperature that autumn had remained pretty consistent, but every time I walked in that house, it felt like the temperature had gotten at least a degree colder. The delivery to the strange man in the house on Lamont Street might have been the most interesting part of my workday, but it's not the only part. My relationship with the manager at my store was souring. One day, an argument resulting from him deeply cutting my hours led me to quitting on the spot. That's the service industry for you. You're always replaceable. But that works both ways. And a week later, I had a new job driving deliveries for a different restaurant. A Chinese place this time. It was a step up. The hours were more consistent, and it paid $1 an hour more. That didn't mean I didn't still think about my best customer from time to time at the sandwich place. Janice was the only coworker from there I kept in touch with outside of work. And I asked her who was taking that delivery every day now. She said no one was. So far, since I'd left, that particular customer hadn't called again. It was the first week of November, and I'd only been there 3 days when an order came in from a familiar address on Lamont Street. Somehow, he even managed to make his order come to the exact same total as his orders from the sandwich shop. I felt an absurd panic. He couldn't know, could he? I'd quit my job unexpectedly, not knowing I wouldn't see my best customer again after the last day I brought to him. And no one else from my work had been in contact with him. But I couldn't have refused if I'd wanted to. I was the only driver working at the time. The owner had told me they were still looking to hire another. I went in the back door of the house and there he was, sitting at the computer just like always. It looked like he had cleaned. There was a fresh liner in the empty trash can and no garbage on the floor. But it still felt just the slightest bit colder than it had the last time I had visited. He actually did a double take when he saw that it was me. A reaction that dispelled my fear, for it finally made him seem human. "Oh, it's you," he exclaimed with a laugh. "You work for every restaurant in town or what?" "No," I said as I stepped inside, and I explained to him my new circumstances, mentioning that I'd heard he had stopped ordering from there. "Just got tired of it, I guess," he said offhandedly. "But now it's time to eat again, and you know me. I only cook when I have to. Anyway, you know what to do." The 220s were on the counter, just like always. And just like always, the change was mine to keep. Our routine began anew. He ordered every day, and every day I got an $18 tip. His trash bag began to slowly fill up again, and the temperature got colder. But I had another surprise before too long. I went into work one day, and there was my old coworker Janice. I'd mentioned the better hours and pay to her on social media, and she had applied for the job. "Thanks for telling me about this place," she said when we got a moment alone together. She then showed me an engagement ring upon her finger that had not been there the last time I had seen her. I really need the extra money because now I've got a wedding to plan for. I was happy that Janice's longtime boyfriend had proposed to her, but I decided to keep the return of the Lamont Street caller to myself. Wedding to plan for or not, there was no way I was giving up my $18 extra a day. But as November wore on, even I began to wonder if it was worth it. When the trash began to overflow, I'd come in to find the used containers filling up the sink. On the day when the temperature in the house got so low that I could see my breath, I couldn't take it anymore, and I said to the man, "It's freezing in here. It's almost winter. Do you think maybe it's time to turn on the heat?" The man still didn't look away from his work on the screen, although his voice was cheerful as always. "I use the wood-burning stove. I travel for work so much it's not worth it to turn on the gas." "Oh," I said, remembering our first conversation. "I didn't think you lived here. I thought you said you were just staying here for a while for your job." The big, shaggy man paused as though thinking of a response, like he'd been caught in a lie. I must not have worded it right. Normally I travel all over the world. This assignment I'm on now just happens to be from home. Most of the time I'm only here a few days out of the month. It made sense, but that pause concerned me. I couldn't help but look at the big old wood-burning stove beside me. It was a massive piece of ironmongery, big enough that a person could probably sit inside. It was cold and dark, and looked like it hadn't been fired in years. As I contemplated it, watching my steaming breath, I was startled by an unexpected flurry of color flashing from the man's computer screen. Looking up, I saw the spreadsheet, or whatever it was gone, replaced by a painfully yellow field that shifted to violet, bright green, and back again. A nauseating riot of colors in which sick yellows, violets, and cyan were the most dominant. Upon this shifting field stood some kind of symbol the like of which I can now barely describe. It seemed to be a circle atop 3 downward prongs that resembled an inverted pitchfork. Within and around the circle were shapes bizarre, like sigils, or maybe even not like any kind of writing at all. I hated it. It hurt to look at somehow, and those shifting, sickening digital colors only made it worse. The man was more animated than I'd ever seen him, sitting upright in his chair and muttering a rush of obscenities under his breath, frantically hammering on the keys with his fingers all the while. "You need to go," he nearly shouted. "Go now. I've got to get this back under control." I all but ran. Something in his voice just had to be obeyed. Rushing out into cold November air that was warmer than the air inside the house, I was already trying to make sense of what I had just seen. A virus, or maybe even a hacker, had gotten into the man's system and flashed all that stuff on his screen. But that image, that symbol, it frightened me. I didn't know why. By the time I got back to my car, my head was beginning to hurt. But the headache only got worse no matter how many pain relievers I took. I don't know how I finished out my shift that night. But by the next morning, I knew I wouldn't be going into work. I felt bad leaving Janice as the only driver that day, but the pain was so intense, I had no choice. I was lying in bed, dreading how I was going to pay for an ER visit when the headache suddenly vanished as quickly as it had come. The ordeal had exhausted my body, and I slept and remembered none of my dreams. I must have needed the rest, because I didn't wake up until an hour before my shift was to begin the next day. They were unusually glad to see me, as they had no other drivers. "Where's Janice?" I asked. "I thought she was supposed to work today. She didn't catch whatever I had, did she?" I laughed, but the manager scowled at me. "Janice is fired," he snapped. "She went out on a delivery and never came back. Won't answer her phone either." The manager seemed annoyed and inconvenienced when he should have been concerned. Janice had a kid to support and a wedding to pay for. She was a damned hard worker. There was no way she'd just bounce from a job in the middle of a shift. Being a delivery driver was dangerous, even in small college towns like ours, where we didn't think bad things happened. The folks in charge of the restaurant didn't want to hear it. We were all replaceable anyway. Plus, orders were piling up, and they were practically shooting me out the door to get them delivered. The time of the daily Lamont Street order came and went. Had me missing a day, thrown things off somehow? Impossible. It's not like he knew when I worked, and why would it matter? Like I said earlier, I'd had days off before. Night fell, and an order did come in for Lamont Street, but it was a different address. As I turned onto the streets, I thought it was going to feel strange going past the house that had paid me so well for so long without stopping. Except I did stop. I had to. Parked in front of it, exactly where I'd always parked when I made the deliveries, was Janice's car. There were no lights on inside. There never were. Why I didn't call the police right then, I don't know. Knowing the place, knowing the man who dwelled inside, it just made it seem like my responsibility somehow. I pulled over, my delivery forgotten, and went to the back of the house. There was no answer when I knocked, not that I thought there would be, but when I tested the door, I found it unlocked, and I let it swing open to the darkness inside. The computer monitor woke up when I stepped inside, bathing the room in the pleasant lights of a login screen against a generic wilderness background. The man was nowhere to be found, but the computer chair at which he normally sat lay on its back, like it had been kicked or thrown over. I started to approach it, but stepped on some kind of box. It crumpled under my weight, and its squishy contents nearly made me slip and fall. After regaining my balance, I turned on my phone's flashlight to see what I had stepped in, only to find it was food from our restaurant. I had stepped on one of the containers that had scattered onto the floor when the bag containing them had fallen. It was all the same things he usually ordered, an order that always came to 21 and some change. It was then that I realized the house was not silent. I could hear buzzing, my light shining before me. I approached the kitchen and beheld the garbage that filled the double sink as well as the wall behind it, swarming with insects. They seemed to be different species, flies, bees, hornets, all feasting upon the muck that festered, except it seemed like there was something more splattered among the waste of Chinese takeout, something wet and more recent, and these mindless, varied insects worked with disturbing cohesion as they swarmed this unidentifiable gory mess and slowly ripped it apart. On the counter, just like always, were two $20 bills, crisp and clean and new. My gorge rising, I stepped backward. There was a scream of metal as the wood-burning stove's door swung open. Something like a massive spider leaped out of it and brushed my leg, sending me bounding sideways and nearly tripping over the fallen chair. The computer emitted a high-pitched whine, and I felt my headache returning as the friendly wilderness photo disappeared, replaced by a black background. On it stood the symbol, now in hellish red, a circle to the heavens, and 3 prongs down to the earth, the shapes and sigils within and without. For the one who is within and without, yet must be kept away. I don't know how I knew that much then, and I know nothing else of it now. I'd give up much to know even less than that. All of the cold that had accumulated in the house over the months was banished in a burst of flame. The old stove roared to life behind me, filling the room with hellish orange light, turning from the damnable symbol, for the one I saw, what had touched me from within the stove. It was no spider. Jutting from the smoke-belching inferno within the stove was a woman's arm and hand, on the finger of which was an engagement ring I knew all too well. The stink of burning flesh was joined by the stink of burning wood. The 2 front doors sizzled as the image from the computer began to burn itself upon them. From above me, I heard sudden thuds as heavy work boots walking across the floor. I got the hell out of there, remembering as I ran that the house was a 1-story ranch. There was no 2nd floor. The police came, along with the fire department, and there were a lot of questions for me. I told them everything I knew, and most of what I saw. The charred human remains found within the wood stove were eventually identified as Janice's, but cause and time of death could never be determined. As for the computer, its hard drive was completely and literally fried, as if the machine had suddenly and severely overheated. Nothing could be recovered from it at all. But as for the swarm of insects, I must have been seeing things, the cops said. Sure, there was trash in the garbage can and sinks, but nothing gory like what I had described, and certainly no swarms of bugs. Not at this time of year, and not in this weather. The markings burning on the doors? Investigators found nothing of the sort, although soot from the raging fire of Janice's body in the stove had blackened them and other surfaces. That must have been what I saw. As for the fire suddenly starting on its own, the way I described, I must have been wrong about that too. It turned out the house was a rental property that belonged to an old woman who lived in the neighborhood, and she had rented it to its current tenant at the start of September. The man, whom she described as being of large build, with long hair and a beard, had given his name as E.F. Elion. The woman had her hands full with caring for her ailing husband, so she hadn't been able to do most of the diligence of background checks on E.F. Elion. If she had, she would have discovered that no such person had ever existed. I didn't go back to work after that. I was too messed up to do anything. Combining that with my already existing depression, I don't know how I made it through that time without taking my own life, or trying to. I couldn't afford to keep my apartment, and I had to move back home. As for trying to pursue any kind of career, that was also out of the question. I'm still in my hometown where I wait tables for a living. My father, well, he doesn't give me any crap anymore. I'd like to believe it's because he knows I've been through enough, but I think it's more because he sees something in my face now, and that something scares him. To this day, the homicide of Janice remains unsolved, and the man using the alias of E.F. Elion remains the only suspect. You could receive a substantial reward if you have information leading to his whereabouts, but I don't think you do, and it wouldn't matter even if you did, because it's my fault. I killed Janice. I left her son without a mother, and her husband to be without a wife. I killed her because she took the order to that house on that day I called in sick, and for whatever reason, because it wasn't me who walked in the door, she died. I wasn't just delivering food. I was part of some purpose, some plan. I was part of whatever work that man was there to do, and when I didn't do it, Janice paid the price. I still have dreams and ambitions. I dream of moving from city to city, town to town, restaurant to restaurant, working delivery driver jobs until I find him in another place, in another house. Maybe I'll kill him. Maybe I'll keep delivering him his food. I'll do whichever one it takes, just to make sure what happened to Janice never happens again. Even if I never find him, I still have to get out of the restaurant I'm in. I'm around the kitchen too much as a waiter, and the smell gets to me. When it gets too bad, my head hurts. I see the indescribable symbol in customers' tickets, and the smell of cooking meat becomes burning human flesh. I smell Janice burning, and I hear his words. Now it's time to eat again, and I only cook when I have to. For starters, we both work at a hospital and work until 1 a.m. This all happened about 2 weeks ago. We worked a 12-hour shift due to our departments being slightly understaffed for the night. We're leaving the hospital around 4 a.m. We usually take the highway, but the on-ramp was closed due to an accident, so we decided we'd just take normal roads home. It was going well for the first 30 minutes, until we get to a part of the trip where the once touching residential houses became nothing but woods. The speed limit was 25 because it was still a residential. There was probably one house every 2 miles. My girlfriend and I were talking about the new Lil Ducky song, and having a nice time, when I got this awful feeling I'm being watched. I looked into the back seat, feeling I would 100% see a person sitting back there. I start observing the tree line to my right, and see nothing. Then we happen to slam into a deer running from the left side of the road from the woods. My girlfriend screams, and I start to look around to see what just happened. I see the back and legs of a deer stumble away before getting distracted by my girlfriend shaking me, asking me what the hell just happened. I told her, "You hit a deer," and was then forced outside to see the damage on her car, because she was too afraid to leave the car. I open the door and go to the front of the car, and look at the grill. I can't see anything due to her headlights still being on. I flick my wrist to signal to her to shut her headlights off. I turn my phone light on, and turn my head to see where the deer ran off to. My girlfriend kills her headlights, and perfectly where I was looking, I see a set of glowing eyes in the tree line, starting at the height a deer's eyes would be. I look away to see if there is any damage. We were only going 25, so it was just a small piece of the grill that was broken off. I give her a thumbs up, and I start walking back to the passenger door. I grab the handle, and decide to give the deer one last look, and I see the same set of glowing white eyes, but now standing about 6 feet. My heart sinks deep, and I get in the car. I tell my girlfriend there was minimal damage, and to just drive. She kept asking questions, and I wasn't ready to tell my girlfriend, who gets extremely scared very easily, that I saw the deer we hit standing and watching us. She asked how the deer was, and I said, "You were going slow, and just lightly tapped it, and I saw it walk off and it was fine." I also worded in that there wasn't any blood on the car or ground. She finally takes off and I feel 100% safer. Something tells me to look back using the side mirror. I glance into the mirror and slide down the seat so I could see the deer. It was no longer standing in the tree line, but in the middle of the road. I see it in her backlights, and I can see that it is not a deer. In the red glow, I saw a very tall man, in very little or very worn clothing. My heart must have skipped a beat. It was just staring with its piercing white eyes, looking right at me. I didn't say a word to my girlfriend the whole way home, and haven't since. We drove in silence for 30 minutes or so, until we got home. Then she starts saying how lucky we were. I was asking her why she said that, thinking she would know what I just saw. She says it could have rolled up the hood and into the windshield. I breathe a sigh of relief. We get out and start looking at the car. The grill had more damage than I remember seeing, but it wasn't too bad. I apparently missed seeing a hand-length stick, thick as a tube of toothpaste, in the grill. My girlfriend takes it out and throws it to the ground like it's nothing, but I'm thinking to myself, why would a deer have a stick on them? Or how would they, is a better question. We go inside and start making dinner. The image of that thing's eyes are burned into every thought. I try to stay focused, but can't. I excuse myself to the restroom, and I take out my phone. I start looking up its features, and compared what happened to me to other stories. I had a hunch that it was a skinwalker, but being an avid scary story reader and listener, I never assumed they're true until that night. I let it go, and thanked God my girlfriend and I left unharmed, and got home safely. I'm still thinking about it today, and feel so unsettled. Night 1. The dog started barking again, as usual. I should have expected it by now, to be quite honest. Every morning at 3:15, the dogs would get in an uproar over something in the field. Either a family of raccoons, deer, or recently the occasional coyote pack made its way near my property. I used to be able to hear their barking and fall back asleep, but the coyotes make me nervous now. They almost attacked Sue, my oldest hound. Ever since that night, I shoot up like a bullet when they begin barking. I can't have a pack of coyotes attack my dogs, or destroy my crops for that matter. I looked out my window to the moonlit field but didn't see anything. Per my routine, I grabbed a powerful flashlight beside my bed and to shine it through the window to see any reflective eyes. Sure enough, 6 pairs of eyes lit up in the darkness. Deer. I opened my bedroom window and began to yell. "Go on, get out of here, scram!" My yelling only made the dogs bark worse, but the deer became frightened and leapt away into the tree line. This was my normal routine. I would grow tired from it at first, but now, I'd wake up every morning at 3:15 like an alarm would go off in my head. That night, I laid back down and fell asleep. My normal routine. I woke up around 3 or so, but to complete quietness. I couldn't fall back asleep until I got myself up and walked around for a minute or so I went to the bathroom connected to my bedroom to take a piss. The moonlight shining from outside shined just enough into the bedroom to allow me to see without turning on the lights. As I walked back to the bed, out of habit, I looked out the large window to see my field. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. Far off in the distance, near the tree line, it looked like a single person standing alone. The figure should have been darkened, but instead, it was paler than expected, as if it had some white clothing on. The trees cast a dark shadow against the moonlight, so I couldn't get a good glimpse. It wouldn't be the first time some teenagers had stumbled onto my field before, so I became more annoyed than frightened. I squinted my eyes in the darkness and found my flashlight. As I shined it against the tree line, the figure was gone. I swayed it for several yards up and down, but nothing was evident. It was odd, but they probably saw the light and came to their senses. Besides, the dogs would bark if anything got too close, Night 2. The dog's howl woke me up this time. 2:36, earlier than normal. The light inside my room was much dimmer now, as the moon cycle began to take place. I remained in my bed and listened to the dog howl. That was Traeger, my youngest pup. He was always a feisty pup. Anything could get him to spark up. I chuckled at his repetitive barking, going from a howl to bark at the flip of a switch. I figured I could get up and let my old bones get their nightly stir a little earlier tonight, so I turned my bedside lamp on and walked to the dark bathroom to take a piss. In the middle of my stream, a sound broke out that sent a chill from my neck to my arms. Traeger began yelping, but not just a quick yelp like he had gotten tangled or even injured. This yelp was almost a scream. It didn't stop, from the time I slid my pants on to when I opened the back door to the yard. As the door flew open, the yelping stopped on a dime. "Traeger?" I yelled, hoping to startle whatever it was that had gotten a hold of him. I shined my flashlight near the dog houses, and I could see Sue just fine, but Traeger was nowhere to be found. Waving it all around the area, I couldn't find him. He was just a pup, and the thought of something grabbing him sickened me more than it did frighten me. I yelled into the empty field as I walked to his doghouse to find any sort of evidence. His chain was gone. The doghouse was fine. Hell, there wasn't any blood. There was nothing. I searched the area for any strange fur or tracks, but came across the most confusing thing of my life. Footprints. I've lived out here in the woods almost all of my life, so I'm a decent tracker, but I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. One set of footprints, beginning 5 feet away from Traeger's house, walked up to the dog and vanished. I searched the perimeter of my house for an hour, but couldn't find anything. I brought Sue in that night. She slept in the room with me. Night 3. I let Sue out during the day as I examined those tracks. I wouldn't admit it to another soul, but I was spooked. Nothing made sense of what I found last night. I'd get someone to help me figure it out, but I live so far out, disconnected from the world. It was my own choice to do this. I chose the life that I'm living. I can't complain about it now. That night, I brought her back inside to sleep with me. I kept the bedside lamp on as I read a passage from the Bible, listening to her snore next to me. For whatever reason, I kept glancing out the window. I'm sure the one reading this has felt that feeling, as if someone or something is watching you. You feel pressured, constantly thinking about your next move because you know you have a pair of eyes on you. I know it was just me feeling spooked from the night before, but I couldn't help it. I smiled at Sue and patted her on her big belly before turning out the light, only because I didn't want to be seen in the darkness, and laying my head down to sleep. In what seemed like just seconds, Sue's growls woke me up in an instant. I shot up, heart racing, looking around the room. My eyes were adjusted to the darkness but couldn't make out anything. Sue was growling at the end of my bed. No, snarling. "Get him, girl," I shouted, causing her to bark. I quickly turned on the bedside lamp and grabbed a pistol in the drawer. There was nothing in the room, as expected. But I was wrong. Sue wasn't growling at anything in the room, but rather outside. She was facing the window, looking at something in the distance. I couldn't see with the lamp on, so I quickly turned it off and grabbed my flashlight and shined it out into the field. To my surprise, there actually was something. A figure stood in the distance, but this time it wasn't alone. I couldn't make out how many, but it seemed like there were at least 5 figures standing behind the first, just looking in my direction. There was no hiding myself as my light shined down upon them. So I opened my window and yelled, "Get out of here, you punks, before I call the police." They didn't move. I directed my light towards them, revealing more detail. The figures were pale, almost ashy, and naked. I could make out 2 women and 3 men. Their mouths were moving, but they were too far away for any noise to be heard. But I could see that they were all saying the same thing. I yelled and shot my gun in the air for the next 30 minutes, but they never moved. After 2 hours, they walked back into the tree line. I didn't sleep that night. That morning, adrenaline still surging from hours ago, I led Sue along the field to the point where the figure stood that night. I could see where the crops had been trampled, but no sign of anything else had been left. Sue sniffed the ground and stared into the trees, but that's all. She couldn't pick up the scent. I set a small trap out for them, as they were actually trespassing on my property, and waited for the night to settle in. The day was incredibly long and filled with dread. Night 4. I kept my lights off that night and talked to Sue. Well, she was rather old. She had only known me for a couple of years. She didn't know my past, so I told her. It may sound weird to you, but I had a full-fledged conversation with that dog. I explained to her my mistakes, on how I had gotten in an altercation with my drunkard dad, and ended up fighting for the worse, to the grave, actually. I was frightened as to what would happen to me, so I fled here, to the 2-story cabin my grandfather had built many years ago. It's off the grid and nobody knows where I am. I've read the papers. People seem to think it was a double murder. My father and I both beaten down in the street in a random attack. I tend to keep it this way, hunting and fending for myself. I couldn't go back to society. Not at this point. I would be questioned to the point of insanity if I made it known I was alive. Insanity, I say as I talked to my sleeping dog beside me. Sue was all I had now. Other than my field visitors, I was alone. Nothing happened on night 4. I fell asleep at 3. Night 5. I didn't hunt on that side of the tree line today. Instead, I marched on the other side of the woods and hunted. I didn't get much, just a couple rabbits. But it fed us just enough to get our bellies full. She was eager to hop in bed. I'm sure it was way more comfortable than a doghouse outside. We crawled in bed as soon as the sun went down, halfway between excitement and horror as to what may present itself beyond the tree line. Clouds had rolled in, and it began to rain, complicating my ability to see the usual spots in which they emerged from. The distant thunder's poetry read itself far away, but the lightning was just overhead. Whenever the flash would pop, I could see as far as my eyes would allow. Even in the darkness, I stared out the window, eyes heavy, waiting for the next flash, and the next, and the next. Before I knew it, I had fallen asleep and dreamed of my father. I dreamt of the day I had ended his life. The only dream I would have of him. To my surprise, Sue's bark shocked me awake. The thunder was directly overhead now, lightning flashing nearly every couple of seconds. Sure enough, in the distance, I saw them. One was on the ground, however, making me clench my fist. I knew my trap would get you, I said to myself. You'll still be there in the morning and all. What I was seeing made me go into a trance-like state. What was just a couple of figures turned into 5, then 6, then 7. Every time the lightning would flash, another one would appear in the large circle they were forming around the injured one, all of them naked and pale. They began to dance almost, moving and contorting their bodies as the rain poured down on their bald bodies. The lightning provided an almost strobe-light effect on them as they danced around the fallen. I wouldn't dare shine my flashlight on them at that moment. I was frightened beyond myself. Sue had only barked once and was now laying by my side with her head in my lap. I watched them circle the one trapped for an hour. As the rain and thunder lightened up, I could hear their voices. I couldn't the previous nights, but as they gathered more numbers, an audible chanting could be heard coming from them. They sang slowly as they circled, but eventually came to a dead stop, as one of them lifted an arm and pointed directly at my window. I ducked my head immediately. Had they seen me? There's no way they could have seen my face in the darkness. I was scared and wanted someone's help, but I couldn't. I was trapped here as these figures danced outside my house. I peered my head up, just above the window pane. 17 pale, human-like figures were looking towards my window, arms and hands extended towards me. I felt my breathing become heavy as I waited for them to move, but they never did. They just stared at me, pointing, until they stormed off into the woods as the sun began to creep over the mountains. I didn't sleep that night. A couple of hours had passed, and the figure that was trapped was now out of sight. I assumed it was on the ground, immobilized. I waited for the sun's protection, and walked outside with my pistol to the trap. But it wasn't anything that I had expected. Their leg caught in the trap was Traeger, my youngest pup. Confused, I knelt down to stick my hand out. He sniffled it like always, and licked it a couple times, but it was obvious he was in pain. I was distraught at seeing my boy caught, but it wasn't anything serious, just a small snare. I scooped him up in both of my arms and carried him to the house to treat his small laceration and bruises. He ate a hefty meal that morning. It was almost as if he had never gone missing for a second. I watched him for hours. Night 6. Sue was happy to see Traeger again, and laid against his back while I shut and locked the bedroom door. I smiled as I watched them play and nip at one another until they grew tired. As confused and slightly scared as I was happy to have them back. None of this made sense, but he was my buddy. I watched them drift off and softly scratch their fur until I fell asleep. Like clockwork, I woke up at 3 a.m. It was raining again, so I was anxious to fall back asleep to the sound of it. Before I went to go take a piss, I felt Sue's warm body with my hand and patted her softly. I felt around for Traeger, but he wasn't on the bed. I squinted my eyes in the darkness to peer around the bed, but he wasn't there. I had been so busy searching for him that I didn't notice my door, now wide open. Something had been in my room, and Traeger was now gone. I began to panic and reach out my hand for my pistol, but it too was missing. Had someone stolen my gun? Was it pointed at me at this moment? The thunder cracked outside, causing me to look in the distance from habit. Of course, when I had picked Traeger up at the trap, I had sat the pistol down and forgot to pick it back up. In all of my years of living here, I had never forgotten that pistol once, and before I could process another dreadful thought, I saw them in the distance. At least 20 strong, they stood side by side in my field, half of my crops destroyed, something that would take hours to do. They stood silent and still, staring at my cabin like statues. Their bald, pale, naked bodies almost glowed in the distance as they formed a line that emerged from the tree line. To make things worse, the one I saw from night number 1 was holding something in his hand. My pistol. It was the only gun I had. I couldn't buy another due to background checks and revealing my identity. The only thing I had now was a large knife I used for hunting and skinning, in which I scrambled in the darkness to look for. When my hands ran across it, a small amount of relief washed over my body, but quickly faded as I heard the chanting once more. I peered my head up, and they had somehow moved yards closer. They weren't in my field anymore, but my yard itself. They weren't staring at my window, however. They were staring downstairs, near my back door. As they chanted, one of the chants sounded louder than the rest. It was coming from in my house. Sue began to snarl and bark once the chanting began, and quickly shot off the bed and ran downstairs. "No!" I shouted, barely missing her as I made an attempt to grab her in the darkness. I heard her footsteps go down the wooden stairs, barking the entire way, but ultimately stopping once I heard her hit the kitchen. The chanting stopped, and to my absolute horror, Sue began screaming and yelping from down below. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed downstairs, yelling the whole way. "I'm coming, Sue," I shouted. "I'm coming, girl." I almost fell down my stairs as I flung myself into the kitchen, my mind already in horror of the whole thing. Couldn't prepare myself for what I saw. There, standing in my kitchen, were 2 of the figures I had been seeing for days. They had small, stubbly hair that stretched across their entire bodies. One male and one female. They stood staring at me. I held the knife in front of me and began to shout. "What do you want?" I screamed. "I have nothing for you. What have you done to my animals?" The light shining on them shook from my hands' violent shaking. The female opened her mouth and began to speak, but a sound I had never heard before emerged. It sounded like one of those videos on the internet where the dog sounds like it's saying, "I love you," or the cat when it says, "Ho Long Johnson." I cringed at the horrific sound as it kept going on, but the male stuck his hand out and stopped, and to my surprise, spoke. "Owner," he said. I froze in place. The words still sounded like those videos, but it had better clarity to it and was barely understandable. "What?" I asked. "Me, Traeger." The figures said in those sounds. They did this to me, want back, showed me how. Now Sue is too. It extended its hand to the female and patted her on the shoulder. The female, Sue, stared directly in my eyes and began to speak, but those same sounds came out as if it didn't know how to properly say vowels and consonants. You're my dogs?" I asked through a shaking voice. "Was your dogs," Traeger replied. "We them now. They teach. We come back." Traeger opened the door, revealing all the figures surrounding the door and windows now, and escorted Sue outside. I watched as they got on all fours and stormed off into the field. They bent and destroyed my crops as they played with one another, until they reached the normal spot I'd always seen them. The one holding my pistol stared back at the house, and simply laid it down at the tree line before it darted off into the woods. I watched Sue pause before she entered. That's the last I saw of them. Night number 218. I don't see them much anymore, causing me to feel very alone. But when they come to visit, I am elated. I would much rather them come to visit in the day, as their normal selves. I laugh and play with them all day long before they leave at nighttime. Sometimes they stay at night, but I'm forced to sit and sleep with their secondary forms. It's odd, but I know it's them. Both of them can speak almost perfect in their human figures, and tell me all sorts of things, ranging from the chanting that makes them feel comfortable, to the circle ritual they've learned to help injured ones get better. They've told me the leader which has turned them all into this, and they travel in a pack. The alpha, the one who stood in front of them all and took my pistol when he didn't know what it was, wants to visit sometime, as they're still trying to understand human acts. I let them out in the evening, and watched them run off into the woods before I shut the door, leaving it unlocked for them if they'd like to come back inside at night. These things are my only company now. I leave the door open for them, hoping to get a visitor. Sometimes I'll find them watching me as I sleep, or even crawling across my floor at night. I'm still getting used to it. I used to live in an old farmhouse with my wife and 2 sons. Darla was the most beautiful woman you would ever see. She had a pair of piercing green eyes and shoulder-length scarlet hair that shimmered like a glittering mirror in the sun. She was truly amazing. My 2 sons, Henry and Adam, were more than I could ask for. We didn't live in amazing conditions. The house was a little run down. Some of the lights didn't work. It was a bit of a struggle to flush the toilet sometimes. It was never dirty though. We always took care of what we had and appreciated the small things. My uncle actually left me the place when he passed away, and that was how we came to be there. We were living in the town not too far away, but it was tough going there. Rent was a killer, and we barely made any progress in life, so we decided to move into the old house as our living costs would be brought down a lot. Darla was at first a little apprehensive about the idea when she first saw the place, but I think the idea of being able to afford better food and clothing and toys for the kids weighed stronger in her mind, so she eventually agreed. We had some difficulty getting settled, but after the stress of getting the place habitable, it died down. We made the best we could of it. The small inconveniences outweighed what it did for us as a family. Looking back now, I truly wish I had made less effort to coax Darla into it. Things would have been vastly different. The land where the house stood was no longer suitable for farming. Something was wrong with the soil, and my uncle had never taken care of the problem and had kind of left it to rot. It did have a certain charm to it though. There were many trees which housed many different species of birds, and even some woodland creatures such as squirrels and foxes. A small lake sat not far from the back of the house. With some work, it could have been a wonderful place. At least that's what I thought back then. Now I wish I could just burn every inch of it off the face of the earth. A Tuesday morning found me in the kitchen tinkering with the stove, as it had been giving Darla some trouble lately, when I heard Adam yelling from outside and running towards the house. I immediately dropped everything and ran out to meet him. He shouted hysterically that Henry had slipped on the bank of the lake and fallen in, and had gone under and not come back up. My heart froze instantly upon hearing this, and I sprinted faster than I ever have to the edge of the lake. Adam caught up to me and pointed frantically to where he had seen Henry go under, and I leapt into the cold water to save my son. A murky darkness met me under the water, and I began to truly panic. not knowing how I would find him if I couldn't see him. Somehow, by some miracle, to my left I saw movement, and I could just barely see a pair of legs thrashing in the water. I struck out towards them, and grabbed one of Henry's legs and pulled him towards me. He went absolutely ballistic, trying to scream, a thin stream of bubbles dashing for the surface out of his mouth. It took me a few seconds to pull him closer and make him see that it was me. He stopped kicking and thrashing, and together we managed to break the surface and gasped for breath, Henry choking slightly on the bit of water he had swallowed in his fear. I dragged him with me to the bank and pulled him out of the water. We just lay on our backs for a while, recovering and catching our breath. Adam sat next to us, crying and shaking out of fear and relief. After recovering, I got up, very angry, and I towered over the boys in my rage, yelling at them about how many times I had warned them not to play by the lake, as I didn't know if it was safe, and they'd always said they wouldn't, but they had broken the rule. In the middle of my rant, I noticed Henry was just staring at the water blankly, and not listening to a word I was saying. I relented and crouched down next to him. He was obviously traumatized, and now wasn't the best time to be yelling at him. I took them inside, and Darla grabbed Henry and sobbed and shook him, telling him never to do something like that again. She took him upstairs to get him dry and into bed. Meanwhile, I rounded on Adam, as he was the older son, and gave him a stern talking to. He apologized over and over, and I eventually let him be, believing he was scared and sorry enough. I sat at the kitchen table with a beer after Adam went upstairs, and drank deeply to calm my nerves. I was still soaking wet, but I didn't care. A short time later, Darla came downstairs with a concerned expression on her face. "Is he okay?" I asked her. "I don't know. He isn't talking to me, and he doesn't even look at me. He looks through me. He's really shaken up. I told them a million times not to go playing there, and they always promised they wouldn't. They're kids, Will. The temptation is too much for them. You know that. You were a little boy too," she finished. I nodded my head. "I know. We need to talk to them again when they feel better. I need to get out of these clothes and dry off." Darla took my empty bottle after I drained my beer, and I went to the bathroom and peeled off my clothes and took a warm shower. When I was done, I went to Henry's room to check on him. He was lying on his bed staring at the ceiling. I sat down on the edge of his bed. "Hey buddy, you okay?" I asked him. He stared at the ceiling a little longer, and then he began to cry. He sat up and hugged me tight, and I hugged him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he sobbed. "It's okay, boy. You're okay, and that's all that matters," I said. He stared at me and lowered his voice a little. "Dad, when I was in the water, something touched me. Something tried to pull me down." "No, son. I was the one who grabbed you. I was pulling you closer to me." "It wasn't you, Dad. Something pulled me under the water before you came." "What?" I asked him uncertainly. I couldn't get anything more out of him, and he fell asleep after a while, exhausted from the ordeal. Later, when I spoke to Darla, I told her what he had said. She seemed just as confused and concerned as I was, and didn't really know what to say. The next day I went down to the lake and stood there for a while, looking out over the water. It was completely still and silent. I could see no movement, no ripples, nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, but somehow the water was almost too still, unnaturally still. I looked out for a little while longer, and then put it out of my mind. I spent the rest of the day finishing up the stove, and fixing some of the lights that didn't work. That night, while Darla and I were in bed, she said Henry seemed to be better now, and was behaving normally. I said I was glad and kissed her goodnight, and we went to bed. There was a strange smell in the air now, a salty, murky, watery smell, and I could hear a gentle sloshing. An icy wind breathed over my skin as I became aware of where I was, standing over the edge of the lake. I faintly wondered to myself how I had gotten here. I remembered kissing Darla and going to sleep, but now I was here. Or was I? I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or not. Somehow it didn't seem like I was, but I must have been. In the midst of turning away from the water to go back to the house, I glimpsed a slight movement in the water and I froze. As I looked on in horror, a dark shape rose out of the water, sending large ripples outwards. It was huge, and flailing out from behind the shape as it rose were long black tendrils that seemed as if they were pure darkness itself. It rose further from the surface, and I realized it was the head of some horrific black mass. A pair of strange glowing amber eyes slowly opened and fixed themselves on me. The water started to churn and boil as it moved, and I felt a scream rising in my throat. Staring at this strange, glistening black mass of eyes and tentacles was going to drive me insane. I began to run, finally letting out the scream that had been bellowing inside me. But I didn't get 5 steps before a slimy dark tentacle shot out of the water and wrapped itself around me. I was lifted, screaming into the air, and felt myself yanked backwards. Then I hit the surface of the water. Down, down I went, endlessly down. I could see the thing more clearly now. It was massive, but it seemed like nothing more than a writhing black mass of tentacles. It was truly terrifying. I thrashed and panicked in its grasp, my fear indescribable, as it pulled me further down. My vision was fading, my breath was gone. I was dying. And then I woke up, still screaming and trying to shake myself out of the grasp of its tentacles. It took me a few moments to realize I was lying on the floor next to my bed, and I jumped up, harshly gasping to catch my breath. Darla wasn't in the room. Everything was quiet. It was morning. It seemed like late morning. I'd overslept. Maybe everyone was down in the kitchen having breakfast, but that didn't seem right. Darla would have woken me as she knew I didn't like to sleep late. Fear and dread crept over me again as I ran out of the room. I went to each of the boys' room, and my panic rose as I found each one empty. There was no one in the kitchen either. I began to scream their names as I ran out the back door and screamed louder when I saw that the surface of the lake churned and boiled, just like it did in my dream. As I got closer to the bank, the white foaming water seemed to calm down, and my soul shattered somewhere deep inside me when I saw Darla's body float up out of the water, face down. 2 smaller bodies floated up seconds afterwards, just before I leapt into the water myself, screaming. I managed with a massive effort to drag them all to the bank and out of the water. I lost myself then, trying in turn to resuscitate them, and when it didn't work, I screamed in despair and tried the next one. I couldn't save any of them. They were gone. My family was gone. I sat there with their bodies for hours and just wailed and screamed in sorrow. They were all I had, my life and my soul, my love, my wife, my beautiful Darla, my wonderful boys, lost so young. My everything was gone. I sit at the edge of the lake every day now. I look out over the water and wonder why. Why didn't it take me? Why did it fool me into thinking it did, while in reality, it took my family instead? I've tried screaming out over the water and demanding to know why. I eventually got to the stage of begging it to just take me too, so I could be with them again. It's all useless though. It never responds. And in the dark place that is now my mind, I seem to understand that for some reason, it didn't want me. It only wanted them.